Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started because we have a full program in store for you today. So we're gonna hit the ground running. So good morning and welcome. My name is Megan De Dios, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us for our annual Ministry Renewal Day. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this by offering presentations such as this one, as well as online courses, videos, podcasts, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our final two courses of the semester begin on November 24th. The courses are A People of Hope and Jesus Foretold and Fulfilled. Enjoy the spirit of Advent by enrolling in one of these courses. Please visit our website, bc.edu/crossroads for more information. We'll also include a link in the chat for you. Thanks to our speakers for granting us permission to record today's webinar. As soon as the recording of today's presentation is available for viewing, likely within a month, we will notify all registered participants of the availability of the recording. At various points during the presentation, there'll be an opportunity for small group conversation in breakout rooms. In addition, please feel free to enter comments and questions at any time using the chat feature. Finally, we are also able to offer live closed captioning for today's webinar. You'll notice a closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen to enable or disable the feature. Many thanks to Tara, Lizzie, Michaela, and James, graduate students here at the STM, for assisting us with the closed captioning and our event slides today. And now for our presentation today, a new moment for religious education, the new directory for catechesis. Our first speaker, Dr. Jane Regan, is Associate Professor Emerita at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She's presently enjoying her retirement from Boston College and exploring possibilities for the next chapter of her life. Her most recent publication is Where Two or Three Are Gathered, Transforming the Parish Through Communities of Practice, published by Paulus Press in 2016. Welcome, Dr. Regan.
Thank you very much, Megan. It's wonderful to see you, and welcome to everyone who's with us today. As I examined the various resources for the directory, which have been published by publishing houses as well as USCCB, etc., I noticed that the prayer to the Holy Spirit is the dominant prayer connected with the study of the document. And so I thought then we would begin today with that prayer. So let's begin this prayer. Please stay muted or get muted if you're not muted. And then we'll have two participants, Andrea and Guadalupe, lead us in this prayer. Andrea, if you could unmute yourself and we can begin.
Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth.
Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. It is great to have so many people here with us for this event. My role is that of MC for the morning as we move from presentation to conversation and back to presentation over the next couple of hours. Our goals for this session are threefold. First is to give an overview of the central themes that are at the heart of the recently published Directory of Catechesis. Second, to introduce you to a text we've recently published that explores those themes in more detail and from diverse perspectives. And to provide an opportunity for you to be in conversation about these elements with other people really from around the world and Boston. Before we turn to the resources of the day, the directory and our book together along the way, let's first find out who's here. We have quite a few registrations and lots of people here already. So we want to begin with a series of questions, survey questions. So if when the survey comes up, if you could just answer that question. The first one is, where are you from? Greater Boston area, East Coast, United States, international. Excellent. Let's do the next one. And the next one is, what setting is a primary focus for you? Parish, school, diocese, other. Okay, parish is pretty significant. Great. And then the next one is years in ministry. 0 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 plus years. Wow, we allowed 20 plus years. Okay, and the final one is about your connection to BC STM. Present student, graduate of STM, Weston, IREPM, continuing ed participant, no prior connection, or other. And Paula just sent a text saying that she's been working for this 50 plus years. So we have some real wisdom in the group. Great. Thank you. To move on, during the next few minutes, we're going to spend some time getting some background on the directory, as well as on the text that we've written entitled Together Along the Way. First, I want to talk about the directory. As you know, it was published in 2020 and issued by the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of the New Evangelization. Hopefully you've had a chance to read some of the text, or at least peruse the index to be sure that your favorite title is included, your favorite topic is included. Let me begin by simply naming my own bias. I think church documents are our friends. In many ways, many church documents, though there are some significant exceptions, provide us with a vision of what the church could be and what we could be as people of God. We see that, for example, in the documents of Vatican II. In many ways, the catechetical, liturgical, and pastoral documents that have been published since then, over the past 70 years or so, offer us a vision of who we could be as church. This is not to say that they are problem-free. There are definitely things worth careful critique, even to the present directory. But my tendency is to presume in their favor, to presume that the document has something to tell us about what the future could look like, and about how we understand our ministry. So those are primary things these documents provide us with. The directory that we're looking at today, the Directory for Catechesis, has a significant pedigree that is worth mentioning here. Now, I'm touching on the history of the directory from Vatican II forward. To look at a wider angle on that, be sure to read Tom Groome's article in Together Along the Way. He goes back to the Council of Trent and the Catechisms and explores that material. In addition, the preface to the directory itself sets that directory in the context of other documents and other directories that have been written since the Second Vatican Council. The first directory that came out in 1971 and was issued by the Congregation for the Clergy. It was a very thin little document that was more about providing a broader sense of the topics that are part of a directory. This was the first time we were doing a catechetical directory. It served as a blueprint for national directories, which was called for in the General Catechetical Directory, or the GCD. The first document, again, that came out in 1971, highlighted the notion of ministry of the word as being the proper context in which to understand catechesis, and very much rooted that in the understanding of revelation that had been articulated in Vatican II in the Constitution on Divine Revelation, or Dei Verbum. Some 26 years later, in 1997, the General Directory for Catechesis was promulgated, again, by the Congregation for the Clergy. This 1997 directory continued to place catechesis within the ministry of the word, but highlighted particularly the relationship between catechesis and evangelization. Evangelization was seen as the broader and vital mission of the church, of which catechesis was a significant an important role, essential moment, the document says. Today, then, we have the directory for catechesis, and that's very much in continuity with the other two, in its emphasis on catechesis as a ministry of the word, and with an expanded understanding or notion of evangelization and of the place of evangelization in the life of the church. When the organizing work for Vatican II was underway, one of the questions was to look back at the First Vatican Council, 1869 to 1870, for kind of some of the ideas of what had been left undone. And one of those topics was the commissioning of a catechism for children to be used throughout the Universal Church. In 1870 at the council, the council fathers had voted in favor of this catechism for children, but it was never written. So the presumption was that the work of the Universal Catechism ought to be resumed with Vatican Council II. However, other voices prevailed and the decision was made to mandate a directory. So by design, a directory is very different from a catechism. While a catechism focuses on content, the directory is looking really at providing a context within which to do our work. It provides an overview of the nature of catechesis and its expression within the context of contemporary culture. So in many ways, the directory as a genre represents a shift from the catechetical practice before Vatican II, with its emphasis on presenting the content of the faith, to a more integrated approach to catechesis, emphasizing the culture and ecclesial context of the day. Here, the focus is on the way in which the whole community can be supported in growing in faith in this time and place. So we have the directory for catechesis. This morning, we hope to give an overview of the directory by examining some of the key themes that shape the directory's exploration of catechesis. In addition to that, we are going to be looking at some of the key essays that are present in the book, Together Along the Way, Conversation Inspired by the Directory for Catechesis. Let me give you a bit of quick background on the book. In the fall of last year, so actually just about a year ago, the four religious educators here at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, that would be Tom Groome, Hosffman, Ospino, Theresa O'Keefe, and myself, got together over Zoom, of course, to discuss what we'd like to do in response to the directory. We recognized that a good deal of very fine work was being done in the form of books and webinars that were basically outlines of the book. So the early books and webinars really just gave section by section overviews of the structure and content of the book. So our thought was to examine some of the key issues from various perspectives and provide, if you want, like a roadmap for you to examine issues that are important to you and to your work. The book was written by 12 authors, all of whom are connected to the STM either as faculty or graduates of our doctoral program, or in some cases both. The creation and execution of the book is rooted in conversation among the authors, among the people who are writing the various chapters, at small groups together to discuss the articles. The creation and execution then was rooted in conversation and invites conversation in the text itself. Each essay ends with a couple of questions to kind of get your reflection or your conversation with other people going. As the slide shows, half of the group examined the long view or the horizon, naming the goals of catechesis and pedagogical and theological and methodological elements for attaining these goals. The second group of authors examined the context, looking at the twists and turns, obstacles and opportunities that are particular to the US reality and the way in which we engage in catechesis, the US reality. All 12 writers have expertise in the field of catechesis as practitioners and as catechetical scholars. Many of them are teaching at universities in the area of catechesis or practical theology. Before we get into the book itself and some of the content, Let me give you a sense of this morning's process. As in the writing and structuring the book, we highlight the role and importance of conversation. So we'll be moving back and forth between brief presentations and time for conversation in breakout rooms here on Zoom. To facilitate conversation, everyone is assigned to the same discussion group each session. To be able to really get into conversation following the first presentation, which is going to be by Tom Groome, we're going to take 5 minutes now for you to be in your breakout room with your conversation partners. Take this time to introduce yourselves, maybe say a sentence about what you're hoping to get from the day. Remember, this conversation is short. You're only going to have about 5 minutes, so be sure everyone has time to introduce themselves. Now, while I'm sure that many of you are experts at Zoom and moving in and out of breakout rooms, if you're not, the process is simple. In a few seconds, an invitation to join a breakout room will appear on your screen. Indicate that you're ready to go, and you'll be placed in one of the breakout rooms. As the time ends, another notice will appear in the breakout room itself, indicating that the room is about to close. And when your group is done within a minute, click to head back to the main room, and we'll see you back here. So James, can we get them into groups?
Well, that went fairly smoothly, I think. So hope everybody got into a group that was heading for a group, and we will continue from there. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, who really hardly needs an introduction, but let me go ahead and do it anyway, because it's my job. Professor Thomas Groome is widely published author of works that are scholarly, popular, and curricular in religious education. His most recent book, most recent, like arrived yesterday, What Makes Education Catholic from Orbis, has, as I said, just come out. Across the years, Tom has been director of the old IREPM, as well as chair of the Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry in the STM. Tom is in his 45th year at BC. So obviously he came when he was very young. So Tom, you're on.
Can you hear me now? Okay, wonderful, ready to go. This is marvelous. I'm just delighted that this day is happening and that we're all assembled together to talk about such a crucial and vital and important topic as sharing our faith. And I'm just here remembering that we began this day at the old IREPM, now the Department of Religious Ed and Pastoral Ministry within our School of Theology and Ministry. But we began this day 25, maybe 30 years ago at the old IREPM, and we called it Minister in the Vicinity. In other words, it was for the locals. And here the vicinity now, thanks to Zoom, has people coming in from Limerick and God knows where else, from all over the globe. So it's just marvelous that, and I want to thank the Continuing Ed Office, Megan and Cara and James and their helpers for keeping on with this good tradition. At mid-November, most religious educators need a bit of a boost, and thank God we're doing it. Thank you, Jane, for a very fine introduction. Oh, thank you for mentioning the new book. By the way, I just happen to have a copy of it here, What Makes Education Catholic. As you remember, my son Teddy always needs new shoes for the winter. So if you would like to contribute to his shoe fund, it's a good book. It's a great book, I think. I think it's probably my best book. It's probably my last big book to write. And it kind of does close a conversation. I've been writing it for about 40 years. And then with COVID and all the rest of it and being home more often, I finally got time to write it. So I'm excited about it. It's certainly a good text, I think. And as Jane well laid out for us, these directories that have come from the Vatican have all been fine documents. And that's one of her great slogans, that documents are our friends. And she's right. But you do have to read these. Most of the church documents that come our way, you have to read them selectively. But these documents, these directories, are excellent documents. By and large, 95%. They're very fine and continue in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and the renewal and aggiornamento and so on that Vatican II launched. An interesting detail as well is that all of going back to the Council of Trent, in 1560s, all of the documents about religious education catechesis that the Vatican has issued were issued by the Congregation for the Clergy, because the clergy were considered the prime catechists. This document, for the first time in the history of the church that I know of, is issued by the Congregation for Evangelization. And as Pope Francis never tires of saying, we're all called to be missionary disciples, to be evangelizers. So this is addressed to the whole people of God and treating each one of us as if our baptism calls us to be catechists and to share our faith with wherever we find ourselves. Let me move to my own essay. I entitled it, and really this does summarize what I wrote about, What Faith and How to Educate for It. And I think they're the two they're two of the foundational questions that all catechists and evangelizers have to face. What faith are we to share? What faith are we to educate for? And then how do we go about doing that, especially within intentional pedagogy? Beginning with the topic, what faith? There's a long lingering Catholic tradition that faith is the equivalent of belief, that our faith is what we can confess as our creed when we stand and recite it on a Sunday, that's our faith. And this emphasis on belief, of course, it's valid, but posing faith, or belief rather, as the sole purpose of catechesis, getting people to believe things, that really began with the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which, as I mentioned earlier, was published. The Catechism, the Council ended in 1565 or 63, I believe, but the Catechism was published in 1566, and it was by far the most influential document that came out of the Council of Trent. The documents of Trent, some of them weren't even translated into English until the late 1800s, but the Catechism was immediately diversified throughout the world, translated into many languages. It became the yardstick of Catholic faith. And so, I mean, the emphasis that Trent, in a sense, put on belief was understandable. It defined faith as belief, and even as unhesitating assent to, and I'm quoting now, to the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, which is the sole mediator and interpreter of divine revelation. Now, that emphasis on belief was understandable in the historical context of Trent. It was at the height of the Reformation. Many beliefs, old traditional Catholic beliefs, had been seriously challenged, even changed or denied. Do we have 7 sacraments or 2? Do we have, is it faith alone that saves, or faith and good works? And the reformers were urging people to move away from devotions to Mary and the saints and so on. So there was huge upheaval going on. And so in a sense, it was understandable that Trent would emphasize belief as the core of our faith and what to believe. And then, of course, they issued the Catechism. And for the next 400 years, we basically lived and functioned as Catholic Christians with question and answer catechisms. And the Baltimore Catechism, of course, was the most widely used catechism in this country, in the U.S. Church, the Maynooth Catechism in Ireland, the Melbourne Catechism, and so on and so forth throughout the world. And likewise, just as there are great beliefs to our faith, there are also great symbols that I think people should know by heart. A wonderful, rich phrase from that old catechism era. In other words, they should have memorized, beyond memorizing, the creed, the commandments, the key prayers, and so on. And yet, Christian faith, Catholic Christian faith, is far more than our stated beliefs. And I suppose this was one of the great achievements of Vatican II, to redefine Christian faith as our whole way of being in the world. It engages not just our heads, but our hearts and our hands as well. What we believe indeed, but also our relationships, our spirituality, our prayer life, and then our hands, the ethic, the morals by which we live our lives. It's to be a whole way of life. Gaudium et Spes, let me just quote it, one quote. It says, faith is our free response to God that is to penetrate our entire life. And all 3 directories have echoed this sense of faith and writes at large that faith is our whole way of being in the world. Let me give a couple of quotes from the directory. Christian faith is first of all the welcoming of God's love revealed in Jesus Christ, and then sincere adherence to his person and the decision to follow him. In other words, to walk in his way. Another quote, faith implies a profound existential transformation. In other words, it affects the whole being of people. And being is a noun and a verb, who they are and how they live their lives. And is to manifest itself at all levels of the Christian person's existence. I summarize in my essay that the directory calls us to a living faith. And by that, I mean a faith that is alive, vibrant. Remember with the Samaritan woman promising that his gospel would always be fresh, springing up, never rancid or putrid or stagnant water, but fresh water. It should be an alive faith. It should be a lived faith. Christian faith has to get done. I often, when I was teaching undergrads, that often say, but professor, can't you believe it and not live it? And I said, yes, I do that regularly, but I call it sin. If you believe it and don't live it. So it has to get done. It has to get lived. And you could pile on the scripture quotes. Even when his poor mother came looking for him to bring him home, Jesus said, my mother and brother and sisters are those who hear the word of God and live it and keep it. So it has to be lived. And it has to be a life-giving faith for oneself and for the life of the world. And this is deeply echoed throughout the directory, this holistic sense, totalizing sense of what it means to live in Christian faith. Now, then the question becomes, how do we educate for such an existential faith? In other words, one that affects our whole existence. If it was only belief, I think we did well. There was a place for it in its time and place of memorizing a catechism. But to educate for a holistic sense of faith, the directory emphasizes the essential role first of the family and then of the parish. And that's totally reasonable, because if you're talking about forming the very being of people, then primary socialization obviously is imperative. And it has beautiful sections on the family and the parish as prime educators, and echoes a lot of great work of colleagues like Jane and so on over the years with that emphasis. And then it moves on to a pedagogy, because we do need intentional pedagogy as well. And what would you know? But its whole understanding of how to go about doing educating in faith, the pedagogy, it says begin with people's own lives, begin with their own experience. I would say begin with their own praxis and engage them, actively engage them in the teaching, learning dynamic, and then give them persuasive access to the great truths and values and dogmas and doctrines and practices and wisdom of Christian faith, what I would call the Christian story and vision, and then invite people to integrate the two, their own story and vision with the Christian story and vision toward lives of lived faith, weaving them into a living faith. And the directory says that the ultimate warrant for this type of a participatory, engaging, conversational pedagogy is the work and the practice and the public teaching ministry of Jesus. And it says it very explicitly over and over that this is how Jesus taught, engaging people's everyday lives with parables, examples, metaphors, similes, analogies, and what have you, getting to think about their lives, often turning their lives upside down, giving them access to the gospel, of God's reign, and then inviting them to embrace it, to take it to heart, to put it to work in their lives. It's a no-brainer. I've often boiled it all down to saying it all comes down to bringing life to faith and bringing faith to life. So that's where I come out, and that'll be no surprise for any of you. Let me say a couple of words about the next three essays, just to tempt you into the text. The essay that follows after mine is by our colleague Nat Samuel, one of our fine graduates of our PhD program, now at Loyola University, Chicago. And Nat's essay is Catechesis in the Community of Hope, and it basically focuses on that it's a difficult time for hope with the COVID, with the growing political divisions in our country and so on, but that Christians need to be people of hope, which doesn't mean being simply optimistic. It means being willing to work for our hopes and yet and entitled to lament. 1/3 of this 150 Psalms are Psalms of lament. We're entitled to lament when our faith, when our hopes are not fulfilled. And yet, as Christians, we have to keep alive that eventually good will triumph, that falsehood will not have the last word, or whatever, that addiction will not have the last word, blah, 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 whatever it is, that there is always hope. And we have to educate people for hope as well. That's Nat's essay. That the church should be a community of hope. The third essay is Susanna Singer, again, one of our graduates, 30 years, an Episcopal priest, served as the faculty of the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley for many years now, early retired. And in a sense, Sue asked the question, well, what is religious education? Now, this is my reading of it. She basically says, it's very simple, really. If you get good religion and good education, and you put the two together, you'll have darn good religious education. Now, she says it a little more sophisticated than that. She talks about having contemporary theology and an engaging pedagogy, and that both are imperative, and especially in this postmodern, post-Christendom world, that we can't just tell people what to believe. We'll have to bring people, invite people to see for themselves and embrace it themselves, which in a sense invites them into a certain theological sophistication. And that's very much what Sue is advocating. The last essay I will mention is Tim O'Malley. It's the fourth essay in the collection. Tim is at the University of Notre Dame. We'll forgive him for that. And I hear that he's one of the most popular undergrad theology teachers at Notre Dame, and I'm not surprised at that at all. Tim's essay is called Slow Catechesis. And then the subtitle is Liturgy, Popular Piety, and Beauty. And Tim's whole trajectory, really, of his life work has been the deep partnership of liturgy and catechesis. And he highlights the power of liturgy, not simply to worship God, as indeed that's its first purpose. We never use the liturgy to teach. The first purpose of liturgy is to worship God, but how we worship God, the prayers we say, the songs we sing, the symbols we assemble, teaches very powerful, but very, very powerfully. It teaches not didactively, as Tim says, but experientially. It's been his passion, and he calls it a slow, festive catechesis, the liturgy, but it also may be well our most effective catechesis. So Tim's essay, you'll find very inspiring as well. Thank you all. Blessings on your good work. And I'm happy now to hand the baton back to my good colleague, Jane.
We now have our first conversation. You'll have just under 15 minutes in your group with these questions. Let me just put those up. What idea, insight, perspective did you find helpful or interesting or challenging? And what implication does a presentation have for how you engage in or imagine your work? Or the basic theological question is, so what? What difference might it make in how you think about what you do? So again, we'll now break you into your discussion groups, and you'll have just under 15 minutes. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and start. Our next speaker is Dr. Theresa A. O'Keefe, who is a professor of the practice at the School of Theology and Ministry here at Boston College. Her areas of expertise are youth and young adult faith, religious education, and practical theology. Her very fine book that came out from Paulus in 2018 is entitled Navigating Toward Adulthood. It's a theology of ministry with adolescents and young adults. I think you'd enjoy it. She's enjoying a sabbatical this year, and she's working on another book, this one on religious education. So we're looking forward to getting that. So Theresa, you're on.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. This is great to be a part of this event. And it's also great to be a part of having put this book together. I want to kind of give us a little shout out to the book itself. People get a sense to see what it looks like. Together along the way, conversations inspired by the director of Catechesis. I'm going to be looking at 4 chapters and the theme that kind of moved us to within each of those chapters. So let's start with myself, of course. So mine's entitled The Horizon and the Guiding Community. And what I was inspired by, because of my work with adolescents and young adults, I was inspired by a line in section 77 that says, Christians, the goal of catechesis is to help Christians to give a complete meaning to their existence, educating them in a mentality of faith in keeping with the gospel to the point of gradually coming to feel, think, and act like Christ. My reason for focusing on this is because I'm very aware that we're doing catechesis in a time of disaffiliation, and where many people, actually I should suggest that there are probably more people disinclined to religious belief and belonging than there are people inclined to it. And in large part, I would suggest that has to do with lots of factors, but within the Catholic context, I think there's a few things that happen and the Christian faith becomes obscured. One, simply enough, is people are unfamiliar enough with Christianity that it seems to, in fact, just simply be meaningless. It doesn't seem to be about anything. And so it becomes really important for us to think about what makes religious faith valuable and meaningless. Another hugely important factor in all of this is the sexual abuse crisis and other misuses of authority by the church. The church undermines its own authority as the keeper of the gospel and the liver of the faith by its many, sometimes extraordinarily serious misdeeds over time. And then there's just simply the reality of living in a contemporary world where there just seems to be unending options, and it doesn't seem to matter which one you choose. And so in all of that, the question becomes, well, why do I believe? Why would anyone believe? What is belief and what's the point? So in my chapter, I raise those things with some detail, but then I talk about how might we respond in light of that? And I suggest that to develop a mentality of faith, there are three things that we might do. One is make obvious the meaningful connections to people's lives. Don't think about catechesis as simply kind of an inside job, or we're just sharing ideas that we already know make sense to people. Rather, take the time and the effort to make explicit connections to why is this faith important for the life we actually encounter in the world? Why does this faith help us see the world differently? Why does this faith engage us in life in a meaningful way? And what's its value? The secondary piece of that, then, I argue, is then to make it accessible. Very often we talk about religious faith as if people already know what we're talking about. Now, granted, religious communities are full of their own language and jargon, like sacrament and incarnation and things like that. And so it becomes important for us to take the time to say, what in the world do those words mean? How are they intelligible to anybody? And what I have discovered over the years is that it's sometimes best to imagine speaking about our faith as if we're speaking to someone who has no concept of it first, because what does that do? It helps the catechist and the religious educator break out of the language structures that they already have familiar to themselves and realize, wait a minute, what does this mean to people who don't speak this language? How does this make sense? And the connections become more obvious to yourself as the catechist and more clear to the person who's receiving it. The third point I raise up in the chapter is the absolutely essential nature of having a compelling community. The faith makes absolutely no sense if nobody's living it in a way that others can look at it and say, I get it. I see the worth. I see the value. The lives people are living seem to be deeply enriched and prophetic because of the way that they're living out this faith. So in my chapter, concerned with that mentality of faith, I think about what are the things that are essential to it: meaningfulness, and accessible articulation, and a compelling community. To contribute to the meaningfulness, I'm turning to the next author, and that's Stefano Montano. Stefano's our great friend who, unfortunately for all of us, passed away just a couple of months ago. He was teaching at Fordham University after his graduating from the STM. A beautiful man, and we're sorry to have him gone. His chapter, Anti-Racist and the 2020 Directory, springs from the directory's call to attend to the needs of the particular church. So by particular church, what's meant within the document is what's going on in the local, whether that's diocesan or national. So Stefano wants to ask, how is it the church can catechize very intentionally towards being an anti-racist church? Because this is a sin that is deep in the church. But what he also points out to in our efforts to catechize is that the church is so diverse. It's not only had people who've actually benefited from racist structures, but it's also had people who have lived with it and under it. And so we offer within our community, both those who can provide tremendous witness of goodness and prophecy and resistance, as well as people who have to kind of rethink the sinful structure and history of racism that we've lived with. He makes two broad recommendations. One is the need for truth telling, that we can't go forward until we have come to terms with our own history. And he says we have to pay attention to our history of complicity, but we also have the wonderful modeling of saints among us who have lived lives of resistance and hope in the face of that. And in that, we also have to pursue justice as well as seek forgiveness. And so he's saying within the life of the church, we have these diverse peoples and stories that we can draw from to enrich the whole church, especially in the United States context. And then we have to build for belonging. All of these voices have to come together in meaningful ways. We have to be attentive to how do we bring them together for what the directory calls listening, discernment, and purification. This is a communal effort. It's not the agenda of one, but Stefano's talking about its agenda for all. And that goes very nicely, I think, with Lakeisha Lockhart's chapter in Fleshing Catechesis Through Embodied Space. And Lakeisha is at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia.
No.
Her chapter was inspired by the lines that we find in sections 194 and 195, where the directory calls for a pedagogy of incarnation and a plurality of methods. So she's saying, if we're a pedagogy of incarnation, how do we take bodies seriously? Or do we? And what she wants to point out is that not all bodies have been equally welcomed in the lives of our churches. And she suggests that we cultivate spaces for bodies. And she notes that a lot of people today will talk about creating a safe space. And she said, there is no way that we can guarantee people's safety. We have no possibility of doing that because someone may say something harmful. Somebody may do something harmful. And we have no control over that. If we're creating spaces, we're inviting people to speak. However, we can be more responsible for creating courageous spaces where if somebody says something harmful, we have a way of dealing with it. If people have been hurt, we have a way of attending to it. So she calls for what are calling clearing spaces, places where people can come, be themselves, and learn together, and recognizing that there are moments at which we will hurt one another or other times that we will heal one another. She also calls us to pay attention to how historically language and bodies have been commodified, how they've been colonized in different ways for other people's profits. And so people haven't been allowed to be themselves. They're too restricted within our images of who they ought to be, who we expect them to be, right? And she asked us to pay attention to how our language and how our presumptions about bodies limits and harms the actual individuals who are with us in our care. So in light of this, she suggests in her chapter ways that we can create spaces that affirm the imago Dei in all people, right? And she asks us, the first thing to do is learn about and pay attention to the real people who are among you and their real bodily realities. So gender, race, physical ability, sexuality, how have these people been perhaps marginalized in the past, continue to be marginalized now? And what kinds of spaces do we need to make in our settings so that they become clearing spaces for all to feel welcome, to bring themselves, to engage with the Word of God in ways that are fruitful and life-giving? She also encourages us to examine spaces, literally look at your buildings, look at your worship spaces, look at how you gather, and look at what it communicates about who belongs, who's represented, who actually can just even get in the building. These are the sort of questions that we have to ask ourselves if we're going to honor the imago Dei in all people. And then finally, she encourages diverse art forms. we privilege, for the most part, language in catechesis. We're talking. But she says, are there art forms? And our churches are rich in art. Are we using them? Are we creating new art forms? Are we inviting language? Are we inviting diverse songs? Are we inviting diverse modes of expression? So Lakeisha's calling for an embodied catechesis that attends to the real lives of the real bodily people who are with us. The fourth is our own Jane Regan here. And as I talk about diverse forms, it's wonderful then to shift to dialogue, which is Jane's great love. And she notes in the directory this line that they call catechesis as a laboratory of dialogue. And first, Jane in her chapter indicates, well, what does that mean in the directory? And she notes 4 ways that they talk about it. One is that dialogue is a lived capacity. It's a key capacity. People have to use it. They have to engender it in themselves. They have to practice it. But also it makes a theological claim that it is how God engages with humanity. God is dialogical. God is speaking to us, reaching out to us, trying to engage us. And we respond by engaging with God and engaging with one another. Thirdly, the directory sees it as essential for mature faith, that the human person needs to be dialogical in order to dialogue with God and dialogue with the rest of the human family, right? And then fourthly, this dialogue that is inspired within us about our faith is also one that encourages our engagement with the whole world, about our whole lives, and about the life of the world beyond the life of the church. What is valuable to recognize is that dialogue then becomes formative for individuals. It's an opportunity for individuals to become more reflective as they become more articulate, because they have to kind of speak their own thoughts, their own faith, their own understanding. It gives them a chance to, in fact, deepen what it is they believe. But it's also formative for the church more broadly, because hopefully within the church, it fosters a listening stance. And we see within this stance a theme that's coming up this year on synodality. How does the church become more listening and companioning people as it is a church? So, but Jane notes throughout this 3 caveats and 3 hopes. One caveat is that even if a document or a directory says we should be dialogical, doesn't mean we're automatically dialogical. Okay? It requires concerted effort to practice these things. Another thing Jane points out is it's not always safe. Some people, and in some moments, can't speak. And this kind of goes back to Lakeisha's chapter 2, that some spaces don't allow people to speak, or it's too threatening, or too much is at risk there. And we have to be aware of those sorts of things, either by creating more welcoming and courageous spaces, or by allowing people to not speak because of their own anxiety around that. But one of the other things is to note is that dialogue is not just for the members. You people talk amongst yourself. The church leadership, even in this directory, indicates that it's not always even listening to its own members. Okay, so creating a dialogical stance also requires the church to say, what would it mean for the church to listen to its own membership? But Jane's 3 hopes out of this is that it will broaden catechesis. It won't simply be about the things that we want to give, but it's about listening, in that it also breaks down the silos within faith communities, and then it invites new voices and perspectives. Right. So to just finish with the kind of the themes that were drawn in each one, the goal is to feel, think, and act like Christ. And this is done by attending to the context and concerns of the particular church. And it requires a pedagogy of incarnation that takes the lives and realities of learners into account. It uses a plurality of methods to communicate richly. And it challenges us to engage diverse voices and perspectives so we can imagine catechesis as a laboratory of dialogue. So thank you. And I invite you to take some time in your groups and have a conversation on any of that.
We're going to take now about 10 to 12, well, probably about 12 minutes in the small group conversations. They're being put into your groups, and The questions, let me just share my screen one more time. So into your groups. Let me introduce our next speaker, get back on track. Dr. Hosffman Ospino is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He has conducted several national studies on the U.S. Hispanic Catholic experience, for which he's recently received an award from the Catholic Association of Research, which we're all very proud of. He has authored and edited 15 books, academic and general, in the area of theology, evangelization, and religious education. And he and Theresa are co-editors of the book Together Along the Way, Conversations Inspired by the Directory for Catechesis, and which just came out from Crossroads 2021. And with that, I'll turn it over to Hosffman. Hosffman, you're on.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you everyone for being part of this conversation. First of all, before I share a few thoughts about the last 4 chapters that remain to be discussed in this conversation, I want to express my profound gratitude to Theresa, who was my partner in crime on this particular project. It was a great pleasure to together sit down, imagine, how we wanted to bring together these authors and so on. And with the support, consultation, and wisdom of Jane and Tom, this project, has actually proven to be very fruitful. So great experience. And let's look at the last chapters that we need to discuss in our presentation today. So the first, there are 4 chapters that I want to talk about. Let me begin with mine. The chapter, is Lost in Translation: A Roadmap for Catechesis in a Culturally Diverse Church. But before I say something about the chapter, let me frame, the context in which we can better understand the 4 chapters that I will be describing. First of all 4 chapters connect very closely to themes that are at the heart of Pope Francis's pontificate. Questions of accompaniment, questions of dialogue, questions of diversity, questions of culture, how to be joyful disciples, how to be good Christians, and Christians who are committed not only to our faith in terms of doctrines and so on, but also Catholics, Christians who are aware of what is happening out there, what is happening in the world. In other words, these 4 chapters look, along with other chapters like the one from Stefano Montano and Lakeisha and Nat and a few others, are an invitation to do catechesis with the feet on the ground. We cannot imagine a catechesis that is only about doctrine, or a catechesis that is only about piety, or a catechesis that is only about social justice without commitment to the faith and so on. But all these dynamics need to be interweaved. So in chapter 12, I want to highlight something that the Directory for Catechesis says, something that it did not say, that the previous directories did not say with the strength that appears in here. In number 362, the Directory for Catechesis, the 2020 Directory for Catechesis, says that we are witnessing a genuine anthropological transformation. So what does that mean? That means that the way of being human in our day is not that necessarily the one that perhaps prevailed in the 1970s or the 1940s or in the 1800s or the 1600s. We are new as a world, as humanity. And there are many factors that have changed that. For instance, technology or migrations, globalization, the ability that we can now travel into space, the way social media and the internet have revolutionized who we are. But particularly the sense that, gone are the days when, for instance, we would say a Latin American person looks like this and speaks like this, or someone in North America thinks like this and eats this way and dresses this particular way. We live in a globalized world in which cultures are constantly merging into one another. And that is what this chapter addresses, no? In this new way of being human, we need a catechesis that is aware of these anthropological transformations, the interconnectivity that shapes our lives and our communities. In the United States of America, for instance, Catholicism is being entirely renewed by the Hispanic, Asian, and African migrations. No? If we put together these three groups, they constitute together about 65-70% of all Catholics in the United States, especially when we look at the younger levels. And that is a major transformation. So we need a catechesis that understands our changing cultural context. However, the chapter that I wrote for this collection, while affirming the need to pay attention to culture, it also makes a critique. This document, this directory for catechesis, still over-relies on the category enculturation. I believe, as a theologian and as someone who's been studying these matters, that the category enculturation is very rich, and it has actually played a significant role in catechesis and evangelization for almost half a century. However, the category falls short from meeting the expectations, the demands, and the questions of what we are experiencing today. Cultural anthropologists and philosophers and others have been exploring, other categories that perhaps are richer. And one that is emerging at the top of many of these categories is that of interculturality. Enculturation is based on the model of the incarnation. The word of God comes from above and then permeates everything below and transforms it. And then, almost magically, almost miraculously, with God's grace, we end up with Christian cultures, with good Christians and so on. But actually, reality is messier than that, And interculturality allows us to play with the idea that there is a lot existing already in cultures, and that rather than a catechesis from above, where everything comes and is transformed, we need a catechesis that actually, as Jane Regan says in her chapter, invests in dialogue that attends to pluralism, dialogue that attends to the truths and the contributions of people in society, different ways of living. The poor have a lot to say. The people who have been marginalized have a lot to say about faith in life. So we need a catechesis that is more comfortable with tensions, with diversity and pluralism, rather than a pristine catechesis that somehow presents us the world as a perfect place, somewhere above in God's mind, and then we receive doctrines and ways of being, so we can replicate that world here below. So that's a little bit of the chapter, and I hope that this serves as a teaser to read that chapter 12. Chapter 9, actually in chapter 9, Dr. Daniela Chupin-Jerome engages the question of diversity in a similar way, in a similar way, but from a different lens. And she looks at digital culture, catechesis and digital culture. Daniela is very perceptive. She in reading the directory for catechesis, she picked up perhaps the most astute, or one of the most astute observations in that directory for catechesis. The digital world is a culture. And that, I believe, and I agree with her, is a major contribution to the conversation on catechesis. Why? Because many religious educators, many teachers, and many catechists at all levels, we tend to treat digital culture as an instrument to evangelize, as something that we somehow imagine catechesis having its own realm, its own pedagogy, its own ways of life. And then we use the internet, or we use social media, or we use technology to enhance what we do. Somehow we see technology as outside of our everyday lives, whether in church or the catechetical setting. What Daniela and the Directory for Catechesis are telling us is that we gotta shift mentalities. So what we need to start imagining is, what does it mean to live in a world where technology, where digital culture, where the digital experience and is actually the culture in which we live. And this makes sense. For instance, when we know that in the United States of America, every young person spends on average 10 to 12 hours in front of a screen. Imagine the impact of virtual reality that's going to have in our lives. Most of us spend a lot of our lives with phones, which have become appendages of our lives. We are constantly connected to these phones. People spend and pour out their lives on Facebook and Instagram and many other social media. So the digital culture is not an addendum to our lives. It is our lives. It is our culture. And that requires a different approach to catechesis. So Professor Chupin-Jerome tells us that we need to start moving into a mode of doing catechesis that is a way of engaging the digital culture to actually facilitate an encounter with Jesus Christ in others. So we don't abandon the goals of catechesis. We don't abandon the goals of religious education or evangelization, but we now do it navigating, swimming in the waters of this digital world technology. And of course, not everybody's equipped to do that, I mean, if any of us was born prior to the 1980s, most likely we were not born with cell phones in our hands, or iPads, or computers in every room of our house. So this is a brave new world. So we need to learn about this. I mean, contrary to the millennial generation and the younger generations that were born in this, they breathe digital technology. We need to figure out what are the ways to explore this. Dr. Chupin-Jerome says that we need to do two tasks. We need to engage the digital culture by one, listening, and two, participating. When she says listening, she says we need to start asking genuine questions that engage people, especially the young, questions that connect with their lives. This is not about condemning technology. This is not about bad-mouthing all the technology and how fast it's changing. It's about embracing it, but it's a world that moves fast. How do we help people ask questions that are relevant? And in terms of participation, she invites us to form teams that plan, lead, and administer the digital presence. And that requires, this is my addition to what she has said, this requires engaging and working with younger people, the people who breathe and live in this world all the time. Chapter 11 then takes another look at another area that the directory highlights, and that is the parish. And Dr. Susan Reynolds from Emory University invites us to look at the parish as a vital space for catechetical formation, okay? But not any parish. I mean, this is not the traditional, old-time parish in which everybody came with, to mass on Sundays and everybody held hands and everybody was happy and everybody loved the pastor's preaching and homilies, This is the complex, messy parish of contemporary life. And she quotes the Directory for Catechesis, number 321. The parish, is a community of difference where we live into the church as a I don't even know how to pronounce this word. So let's blame Pope Francis for bringing us into these concepts. Polyhedral and synodal reality. In other words, parish life is complex. Parish life brings people in communities of all sorts of life, different types of family. No, of course, we all want to look at the traditional family, mom, dad, and children, and have a community like that, because that's pretty much what we find in church documents. But when we go to our parishes, then we find divorced parents and same-gender parents, and we find people who are single parents, and we find people with no children, and we find all sorts of arrangements, people whose spouses have been deported or children have been deported, and so on. So life is complex, and it has many perspectives. Yet that's what being community is all about. Dr. Reynolds invites us to look at a parish as a teacher. In other words, the parish community, the faith community, is a community where everybody is engaged in the art of interpreting and passing on the faith. And that would require literally reimagine the parish. Because sometimes in a traditional way, we tend to see only those who work in the parish or the priest or the deacon as the ones who define teaching and do the teaching in the parish. Dr. Reynolds, following the director for Catechesis, is telling us we got to go beyond that. No, it's the whole parish as a teacher, and everyone has a possibility. Everybody can be an agent of pedagogy and religious education. At the same time, the parish is a space of Christian life. And this is where synodality comes in. The church is a community. It's a communal reality where we are called to dialogue, to listen to one another, and to plan together, to envision together. And speaking of envisioning, then we got chapter 10 with Dr. Patrick Manning from Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology at Seton Hall University. And Patrick wrote this fascinating chapter, Shaping a Meaningful Vision for Life in Today's World. Now, listen to this number that he highlights from the Directory for Catechesis to begin his reflection. Dr. Manning says, good catechesis is not mere indoctrination, okay? It can't be mere indoctrination. And Professor Groome already actually shared that in his presentation earlier today. But forming the catechized in a mentality of faith, that's a beautiful category, mentality of faith, in keeping with the gospel to the point of gradually coming to feel, think, and act like Christ. What does that mean? Well, Dr. Manning says that catechesis good catechesis should be an exercise of nurturing the imagination. And that means that we got to pay attention to the way in which people, especially people at all levels, but particularly younger people who are in religious education programs, youth ministry programs, colleges, and universities, how people make meaning. And this idea of meaning making is not new. This idea of meaning making is actually part of the catechetical world and thinking that we have been using for several decades. But the idea is, how do we nurture the imagination today, especially in this changing world? In a society, for instance, in societies and faith communities where religions are questioned on a regular basis, when religious authorities and other sorts of authorities have lost credibility, and now they have to make a case for why they are relevant in church and in society. So people have not stopped making meaning. They continue to make meaning. That is part of, it's at the core of being human. So religious education, catechesis, must be that exercise of cultivating the imagination, connecting with the ways people are making meaning here and now. And he proposes 3 practices that I find interesting. 1, experiencing. 2, questioning. And 3, judging. They're very similar, and they echo somehow the pastoral circle, see, judge, act that we have regularly heard in pastoral planning circles, evangelization, and so on. But here, Dr. Manning, following the directory, is more attentive to the critical dimension, the judging, experiencing, asking good questions, and passing good judgment, engaging the faith in a critical and intentional way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hosffman. Appreciate that. We had decided to change our format for the next 10 minutes or so. We have 10 minutes left, and I'm just aware of the that you've been in conversation twice with your groups, and thought that we'd spend the last 10 minutes with comments people want to make or questions they want to raise, that we can address those. Okay, let's see. How about David Amico?
Thank you. One of the things I've been reflecting on during this whole wonderful time is the wonderful vision of the directory and the reality on the ground, that in many instances we have, especially our younger clergy, who don't share this vision. It seems like we're going back to the indoctrination mode, and all of this doesn't make any sense to them. So how do we help perhaps bridge this dichotomy? Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Someone else? Somebody want to respond to that? Hosffman, Jim?
Oh, actually, I'd be happy to respond to it.
Great.
I think one of the ways, David and others, would be, first of all, to actually engage that person in conversation themselves with you and ask them what about that faith is most valuable. One of the things that I find particularly to note is that when many people want to move towards that doctrinaire, they seem, and this is the point I was trying to make in my chapter, they seem to think that what they believe and how they believe it is quite obvious to everyone. And what they don't recognize is they're using insider language that has also the great benefit of keeping people on the outside. So, but if you engage them in conversation where you present yourself as someone who's deeply interested and perhaps even grateful for their faith stance, to encourage them to speak in less coded terms and to break open what they're saying in ways that seem more natural to most people, then I think you'll begin to help them get to the kernel of what they find most helpful. The tendency very often is that they only speak to a small community of people who share their way of thinking and are well trained in that way of thinking. And therefore they think that the challenge is to bring people into that circle. What I'm suggesting is that they break open that circle and they start kind of finding ways to reach out to people. But that requires it on your part that you have to kind of be an honest broker in this and really be someone who seems to be approaching them in appreciation for the faith and the convictions that they bring, and find out what do they mean when they say what they're saying. What's most helpful to them? What's most valuable? And why is it most helpful, most valuable? To kind of push them outside of their own language frameworks in order to start articulating in a way that can make more connections to other people.
Great. Thank you, Theresa. Thank you. In order to encourage as many people as possible to share their ideas, maybe we could ask, instead of asking questions, just make statements. And so we could get in as many as possible. Rita, you're on. Rita Houlihan.
Oh, well, I had a question prepared, I guess, which was about materials. And I'm teaching confirmation to high schoolers. So maybe if people have suggestions for materials that would really help to endorse or further the suggestions that have been given here, that would be great as well. I'd love to see digital, if anyone has seen, and I'll read the chapter that was cited there for the digital work. But so it's more practical questions.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm happy to respond to Rita quickly. Rita, okay. Of all of the published curricula that I know of for confirmation, I think that the best curriculum available out there that I've seen is the Sadlier curriculum. And it's been going on for years. It's been very successful from William H. Sadlier. It's by John, what's his name? He was a senior out in John Barry is the author. But it's been the most used and widely used and longest lasting curriculum I've come across.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Phyllis.
Well, first, I have to say hello to Dr. Jane Regan and Professor Groome, because they were both teachers of mine. And I want to thank them for all those years ago when I was in the first IREPM, one of the first groups there. It's been a blessing my entire life afterwards. But I think, is it Dr. Ospino brought something up that just has hit me like a ton of brick when he talked about a genuine anthropological transformation. I mean, how, to me, that is just a stunning comment, and it has really made me think about so many things that I haven't been able to put a handle on it to understand with all the rapid changes that we're going through, especially in the schools when we have all the social media, the gender issues, the migration, all of it. It's something I would really like to continue to study or to learn more about, and I'll be happy to read that. But it has given me something to frame my confusion about a lot of things on for the moment being, and I very much appreciate that, very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Ed, Father Ed.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm a Franciscan from Chicago, and I'm living down in Louisiana right now. But I want to say I'm very delighted to hear such a positive approach to catechesis, and in particular, the positive image and references to Pope Francis. So in order to, as at the risk of stirring up the pot, I have to tell you, I had a very disturbing conversation this summer with a professor from Mundelein. It was a group of priests. We had just heard confessions, and we were eating tacos, and it was just a summer night. And this guy said he thought Pope Francis was the worst pope we ever had. He just causes division and separation and confusion. This complaint I've heard in other places. The professor from Mundelein, who I really like and respect, said to me, he said, the problem with Pope Francis is that he acts like a pastor. The Pope should be more like a referee, should be given the answers. So I was really heartened by today's conversation, because I think I totally agree with the guy, except that I don't think it's a problem that Pope Francis acts like a pastor. And I think this is the direction our church needs to go. But someone like the first questioner said, boy, I don't know what to do with these. I was in a group of priests. None of them agreed with me. They were all concerned about this Pope who's just sowing confusion. That's what they were
God. It's the most hopeful thing that has happened to us in 50, 100 years, since Pope John the 23rd.
Thank you, Dr. Groome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jesus sowed a lot of confusion too.
That's true. Okay, I'm aware of time, and wanted to thank you all for your participation. And again, you want to buy the book Together Along the Way. And I think you'll find it really helpful to kind of strengthen and highlight some of the things we talked about today. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you at another session of continuing education. So thank you. Bye-bye.